And okay, so this is the Kilkenny Chamber of Commerce Chamber Chat, 25th of March. You're all very welcome. My name is John Hurley. I'm the Chief Executive of Kilkenny Chamber. And without any further ado, I am going to hand you over now to our President, Cullen, for a few words of welcome. Cullen, over to you.
Yes, John, thank you. A very few words, but look, I just want to welcome everyone to our Chamber Chat today. It's a great turnout that we have for what will be a very interesting topic. How we manage our teams and how we deal with our staff over the next 6 months or so is going to have a huge bearing on the success, on our success and how our businesses come out of lockdown. And so we just thought that this topic was something that would be very interesting to small and medium businesses in particular, to help us deal with any issues or all those myriad of questions that are going to come up over the next 3 to 6 months. So you're all very welcome. I hope you enjoyed today, and I'm going to pass back over to John to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Cullen. Without any further ado, I'll introduce our speaker. Well, the topic, as you know, is all around the HR challenges and demands that are coming from this ever-changing world we are currently living in. And our speaker today is Mary Cullen from Insight HR. Insight HR is a HR consultancy and outsourcing firm based out of Kilkenny. Their stated objective is to help Ireland's leading organisations discover the true potential of their workforce. And indeed, in this topsy-turvy world where, you know, our greatest asset in business are our people, this topic is one that resonates with us all today. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Mary. And Mary, as I do so, I will bring up the slides for you as well. So hopefully everybody can see those slides now. Over to you, Mary.
Great. Thank you very much for having me, John and Colin and Roisin. It's a pleasure being here today. I'm a human resources consultant, and I've been working with businesses across Ireland over the last year, trying to help businesses deal with and navigate what can only be described as one of the most strange years in our working history. And today I would be hoping to, I suppose, help you think about some of the developments that are happening in the world of work from an employment law perspective and a working perspective, and also to get you thinking a little bit about some of the issues that you might face, whether you're currently working from home at the moment or whether you're on the front line. We'll be talking about issues that affect all businesses now, big or small. So John, I think I'm going to ask you to move on to the next slide for me. So when I think the first thing that we have to think about in this year, it's been a bizarre year, and employers have a duty of care to ensure the safe and healthy workplace. And as we all know, the HSA have given guidance and there are government guidelines on returning to work. And indeed, for the people that have continued to be at work, they're following those guidelines on a daily basis in relation to your hand sanitation, your mask wearing, your social distancing within the workplace. The world of work has changed fundamentally. And for a lot of us, Insight HR included, you know, last March, we all scrambled to figure out what we should do as employers, whether we should close down the business and send all our employees to work from home, or whether we should put in place social distancing and special measures within our workplaces. And that has been quite a challenge for a lot of people. But 12 months on, and we're still in lockdown, and our lockdown has been quite extended. You know, what are we to do and what are we to think about over the next 6 to 12 months, and what's coming down the tracks for you as employers? As employers, we have to be cognizant of our obligations, and whether our workforce are at home, working in their own homes, at their own kitchen tables or in their bedrooms, or whether they're working on the front line, or whether they're laid off at the present time, we've got things to think about in terms of what our obligations are to those people. Firstly, I think it's important that we name and acknowledge that it's normal that employees and employers are feeling worried and anxious, and fear has become a factor for the first time in the workplace. And well, for a lot of employers, you have to think, well, what's that got to do with me? How am I to manage individual fear? Some employees are more afraid than others. And I'm sure as employers, you've noticed that some people are happy to be back in a frontline position at work, others aren't. Some people are terrified, even if they're in their own homes with minimal risk to them. Some people still have fear and anxiety there. And all of those issues are starting to creep their way into the workplace and become an employer issue in terms of how we deal with it and what kind of strategies and things we need to be thinking about for in that kind of an environment. And so therefore we need to be aware of mental health issues. Certainly at Insight HR over the last 12 months, we have been dealing with a number of clients who have had employees, some maybe with suicidal ideation, some whose mental health has deteriorated, some whose employees are suffering from extreme anxiety at home. And all of that is affecting people's performance in the workplace, whether that's in a retail environment where you've got essential services, in not-for-profit businesses where people are still working, or people at home who have those kind of fears. And I think it's very important that employers think about that and think about, well, how do we address those kind of issues, or how can we be proactive about dealing with those kind of issues if we're starting to see them, if we're starting to observe them. John, would you move on to the next slide, please? So something else that is going to happen over the next 12 months. In January 2021, the National Remote Work Strategy was published by the government. And COVID-19, I guess, has fast-tracked alternative approaches to traditional working. And what that means is by September 2021, this is a guideline, not a definite date, but we're expecting that there is going to be the right to request remote working. And so what does that mean from an employer perspective? Because for a lot of us, certainly I have spent as an employer since last March thinking, well, in 3 months' time, we'll all be back in the office. In 6 months' time, we're all going to be back in the office. We're now at 12 months' time, and we still don't have visibility of when we're going to be back in the office. But have I considered the fact that my employees, maybe by the time all of this is over, will have been working at home for maybe 1 to 2 years? And at that point in time, are they working successfully from home or not? Are they productive when they're working at home? Are they able to balance their childcare responsibilities if there are small children at home with their working ability? And when they have the right to request remote work, what does that mean for employers? Now, a lot of businesses like retail, hotels, childcare, hospitals, service delivery, not-for-profit companies aren't going to experience this in the same way. But all of those businesses also have people who could partially work from home. Certainly when it comes to the administration side of those businesses. And how are you going to deal with the fact that you may in an organization or in your company have some people who could work from home and others who absolutely could not. It is anticipated that employers will have to consider a request for remote working and provide a response within a particular time frame. It doesn't create an actual right for the employees to work remotely, but that's a bit of a conundrum. So they have the right to request it. And people may already say, but sure, they have always had the right to request remote working. The difference being an employer is going to have to give objective criteria for why it won't work, for why a role may not be suitable for remote work. But it is unlikely that employers will be obliged to grant remote working requests. But it is something that every employer has to think about in terms of who might this apply to within my workforce? And what if I don't believe every role is suitable for remote working, even though those certain employees have already worked for 12 months or more remotely? How will I deal with it? And what should I do? And what might be the outcome if I say no? Will I retain the individual? Will the individual raise a grievance? Will the individual see it as somewhat unfair? Will I be creating a situation in my workforce where part of the workforce can request remote working and another part of the workforce can't? So in a hotel business, for instance, you can't remotely serve a table. You can't remotely cook a meal. These are things that you will have no option but to come to work every day and continue to work every day in that way. Whereas there may be other people in that hotel environment who will be able to request and possibly have that right confirmed. John, will you move on to the next slide? So again, already there has been a successful case, and the first of its kind in Ireland, where an operations coordinator resigned from her job because her employer rejected her request for remote work. So very early on, last March, this facilities company, which did facilities management in UCD, had 3 operations coordinators working in a small office. And they insisted that those 3 workers came in and worked together in the office because they felt a remote working situation would not work for them. So they refused to accept the remote working proposals that the 3 employees, all of whom who felt at risk of increased infection from COVID because the office was too small. And they felt that the health and safety measures which the company had employed still did not prevent their increased risk of infection from COVID-19. And the WRC, who is the Workplace Relations Commission, made a ruling regarding that particular situation and ordered the employee to make an award to the employee. And as you'll see, the reward actually is quite small in real terms, given that for an unfair dismissal or a constructive dismissal, an employer could face an award of up to 2 years' salary. And depending on the individual concerned, that risk is quite high. The reason the award was so low was the employee had actually got a better paying job in the meantime. So the award was calculated on her loss, which was only the short period of time from which she resigned from the company and got a new role. But it's something that all employers need to be aware of, because when it comes to asking people to come back into work, and there's many employers who will want people to come back into work and who will want the world of work to return to normal. Already we're seeing case law, which is indicating that you've got to think very, very carefully when someone approaches you about remote working, and you feel that they should be in an office doing a particular role. It's something to bear in mind. And I would also make the point that in order to prove a constructive dismissal case, the bar is quite high. It's not easy. The onus is on the employee to prove that the conditions under which they were working were so bad that they had no option but to resign from their position. And so you can see, if you have a WRC adjudicator supporting that employee's claim and saying that the employer ought to have given reasonable consideration to the proposals where one person would attend the office and two other would work from home, and that they would rotate that particular situation between them, that the three workers would rotate that. And the WRC felt that was reasonable, and on that basis made the award. So it's something to think about even now, if you have people looking for remote working when you feel they should be at work. And the law will, or the law will come into play later in the year, giving those people a right to request it in the first place. And then case law will dictate again how we go about handling that particular situation. John, can you move the next slide? Thank you. And also, we're expecting the right to legislate, or the code of practice around the right to disconnect. So what does that mean? People have probably already heard about the right to disconnect. And again, employers are saying to me, but people already have a right to disconnect. I'm not asking them to check their email in the evening. I haven't asked them to respond to a WhatsApp message that I send into a group chat when they're finished work. I haven't asked them to work late in their role. However, many employees are doing that, and we're seeing during COVID-19, certainly because people are trying to manage alternative work patterns, certainly office workers who are trying to manage alternative work patterns, maybe starting very early in the morning, managing the children during the day, coming back to work later in the afternoon or later in the evening, or juggling those kind of childcare arrangements with their family. But the workday is extending way beyond that which the employee would normally do if they were attending the office. So there has been quite a movement for quite some time about that always on culture. And an always on culture means that if I'm checking my email at 8 o'clock in the evening and responding to it, I'm working in effect according to the law. And so from an employer's point of view, you have an obligation under the Organisation of Working Time Act 1997 to record the start and finish time of each day and the start and finish time of each break. But if people are logging back on to work after their core hours of work in the evening or in the morning before they normally start work, are you measuring and managing what their hours of work are? And are you able to prove that they're only working maximum 48 hours spread over a 4-month period? And that's a difficulty for employers. So the new WRC code of practice, which is due to come into effect, is going to set out guidance for employers and employees on disengagement after core contracted hours of work, meaning that they'll have the right not to respond to a text message, to a phone call, to an email after their hours, their contracted hours of work. And once approved, this code is going to be admissible in evidence before the WRC. So what that means is, although it's a code of practice, and you might say that, well, any code of practice means that, it's a guideline or a recommended approach to dealing with something. It's not the law. It's not legislation. However, the WRC will be admissible in evidence before the WRC, and adjudicators will make awards based on that. There has already been a significant case involving a key pack worker who, unbeknownst, according to her employer, was checking her emails and responding to emails up to midnight on any given day. She argued that she was obliged to do this, and her employer was well aware that she was doing this, whereas the employer tried to argue that she was doing this of her own accord. But the responsibility ultimately rests with the employer. And again, there's a huge fear of overregulation, of remote working, and employee working hours, and fear from employers that this could potentially undermine flexibility in the workplace. But if you're a business who uses WhatsApp, and I see this more and more all the time, to communicate rosters, to communicate messages, to have a general group chat with people, you want to be very careful that people aren't being bothered in their own time outside their contracted hours of work. And you've got to be very clear about, well, what is the expectation? You may choose to work late in the evening after your core hours of work, but once you send that email and someone responds, are you going to be in breach of this new code of practice on the right to disconnect? And it's something that employers have probably got to start planning for now and think about, rather than when this code of practice comes into effect. Can you move the next slide, John? So when we look at this and we think, well, what steps should I take now to manage this new changed order when it comes to the world of work? We would be saying at this point in time, it's probably a little too early to update your policies and your procedures. But I would be recommending that you're testing and preparing. So if you're an office-based, if you have an office-based workforce, and you already have them remote working, I guess you probably have to start thinking about, well, am I sending emails after hours? Am I sending text messages after hours? Let me test it. Let me see what I'm doing, review it, and put in place a phase out or a plan or an approach to phasing that out of how you do business. Don't schedule meetings before or after core hours of work. It might suit the business, but again, in a very short period of time, you are going to find yourself in a position where that could lead you to be in breach of the code of practice. Encourage employees to log off after work and while they're on annual leave, and agree working arrangements that facilitate caring for vulnerable family members and schooling responsibilities. So if you have a situation, and many employers are in this position right now, they don't know what hours people are actually working, and they're trying to manage based on output rather than tracking hours of work. But you're still obliged by law to track the hours that people do. And if you're changing terms and conditions of employment by allowing people to work earlier, work later, log off during the day to mind children, if you're agreeing those kind of arrangements, to avoid a custom and practice situation where it becomes the term and condition of their employment, you do need to have something in writing with the individual that's changing their hours of work temporarily and reviewing it at a later stage so that it can be amended in time. And again, I would say if you're regularly contacting employees after hours, you've got to stop. You've got to think and you've got to change. And that is coming very, very fast. And in some ways, when we look at millennials and the kind of new entrants that are coming into the workforce, you know, 23, 24, 25-year-olds, those employees are far more focused on work-life balance and you know, those kind of things than they ever have been before. And this is representing a real change in how the world of work operates. Next slide, John. So this is a bit of a thorny topic, vaccination, and what is an employer's responsibility when it comes to vaccination. We're all aware right now that our vaccination program is behind other European states and the US and the UK. And employers currently have no control over which employees are vaccinated or not. We all know that the HSE are currently vaccinating vulnerable people and those over 70 years of age. But when it comes to employees, and obviously those frontline workers, excuse me, I haven't forgotten those. But when it comes to employees, employers don't know who is vaccinated and who is not. And that's going to continue right the way through. Yet at the same time, the Health and Safety Authority have updated their regulations on biological agents to include COVID-19. And as part of that, if a risk assessment shows a risk from a biological agent for which a vaccine is available, employers must offer a vaccine. But employers can't currently offer a COVID-19 vaccine. It isn't available commercially. So employers cannot buy it and they cannot engage a private company to come and vaccinate their employees. And furthermore, the HSE and the NHS have not mandated vaccination for their own employees who work on the front line. So other employers are not going to be able to mandate it either. Next slide, John. Employees have a constitutional right to bodily integrity. So if they refuse to be vaccinated for whatever reason, an employer cannot insist upon it. And you may not have a legitimate basis to ask an employee if they're vaccinated in the first place, because that information is protected under data protection legislation. So employers need to think, and some of you may already be engaging with your employees around vaccination about whether or not they are planning to get it, and whether or not the employee is going to be working with vulnerable groups of people will be a factor and will be something that an employer will need to take into consideration. But in an office-based environment, in a retail environment, in a hotel, in an office, you may run into potential equality discrimination issues if, for instance, you try and come up with a policy to say that you must be vaccinated to attend the workplace. What if you can't be vaccinated because your doctor has advised you shouldn't be? What if you can't be vaccinated because you're pregnant? What if you won't be vaccinated on religious grounds? Or I read somewhere recently that vegans may refuse to be vaccinated due to the presence of perhaps animal products in the vaccinations themselves. And what about your disabled employees? So you've got to think about, before you come up with any policy or change to a contract of employment, you've got to think about these issues very carefully. Because if you get information from an employee about vaccination, where are you going to store it and how are you going to store it? And who is going to have access to that information? Because it seems clear that we're not going to be able to mandate it. And therefore, we are going to have to continue to operate our workplaces in line with the public health guidelines around hand sanitization, around mask wearing, and about social distancing. Next slide there, John. So when it comes to what you can do, I would say provide information and education to your employees about the vaccination. Encourage them to speak to their own GP about any fears that they might have. Encourage people to get vaccinated to protect themselves and their colleagues, and update your risk assessments and your work safety protocols. That's very important. And continue to implement the health and safety measures around COVID-19, and that's for the foreseeable future until we get some guidance from the government around that, and from public health around that. And I would say it's a confusing period of time. I know that all of the team at Insight HR are constantly trying to stay on top of, you know, the various schemes that are in place, the various changes that come into effect around different sectors of our society and different businesses. But it's really important that you keep up to date on the discussion, on the developments, and with the public health guidance. I think a lot of these issues are going to be played out in courtroom settings or at the WRC over the next 12 months to 2 years. And we'll have more, I suppose, guidance around how we should approach things then. In the meantime, it's simply about being reasonable, taking reasonable precautions, and talking to your employees as much as possible about things like their balancing of their family commitments with their work life, you know, understanding their fears, ensuring that people are well physically and mentally, whether they're working from home or whether they're working back in your businesses whenever those businesses can open. And also to think about, you know, for those businesses who are currently closed, who have a range of employees who may have gone off into other industries, who may have gone back to their country of origin, who may be at home on PUP payments. How is that all going to be managed when you bring people back into the workplace? And I've seen quite a number of businesses who anticipate being open again sometime in the summer, starting their recruitment drives now, starting to try and build their panels of people now, and maybe that remote training and onboarding and all of that, some of that you might be able to do in advance of opening back up. So that's me for the moment. Pass back to you, John.
Thanks very much, Mary. Lots of food for thought there, certainly loads of information, and I'm sure it's thought-provoking and question-provoking. So we have a Q&A session now, and to get the ball rolling, I see there's a question in already, just in relation to the right to disconnect. There's a question there. Hi, Mary. When can we expect the right to disconnect COP stroke guidelines? Do you have any idea on that, Mary?
Yeah, all of this is working its way through the various powers that be. So we're expecting probably by September that all of this will be in place. But those deadlines are movable feasts. It is coming. It is going to happen. It might happen sooner, but I'm very much like GDPR or any other change in legislation that came into effect. I wouldn't wait until the last minute, because one thing is certain, that as soon as the code of practice is in place, as soon as people have the right to disconnect, they will disconnect. As soon as they have the right to disconnect and you contact them, they will raise an issue about it. They may raise a grievance. They may resign from their positions. You may find yourself in the WRC. So I would plan for how your business is going to tackle that particular issue. You know, inside HR, like lots of other businesses, we use WhatsApp to communicate various things, usually, you know, employment law updates or a link to something that people should look at. But, you know, various people put links in there at different hours of the day or night. And are we going to be able to continue that practice? I don't think so.
Very good. Thanks, Mary. And I encourage people now, if you have questions, by all means, please do use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And while you consider that and give it a bit of thought, I'm going to launch a poll question. So here's the question I'm putting out to everybody. It's going to come up on your screen in a second. And you have an option of answering yes, no, or the third option, which is kind of in between. So the question is, have you engaged with your employees about the future of work in your business? So you'll be answering, please just tick yes or tick no, or tick the third one. Yes, I have spoken to my employees. No, I have not spoken. Or thirdly, I have spoken to some employees. Because this is really at the root of everything that Mary has been talking to us about. We can see the train has left the station. This is actually happening. It's coming our way. We're in the middle of it at the moment. It's continuing to evolve and change. And indeed, as Mary said, many of us are just waiting to see when is this all going to be over and we can return to normal. Normal being that it'll be the way that it was. Well, the indications are that normal will never be the exact same as it was. There will be a new normal, all right, but we need to be ready for what it is. So I'll leave that poll running for just a few more seconds. I see lots of people are answering in there. Thank you very much for your engagement in it. Mary, in the meantime, if I could ask you a question, please. How can you monitor employee working hours when they are at home?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on the business and maybe technology that's available, but there are I guess apps that you can get or platforms that you can get where you have an online timesheet for somebody to complete. If you don't have that, I would recommend a paper-based system where people complete it and send it back to you. But your obligations as an employer have not changed just because of the pandemic. So under the Organisation and Working Time Act, you must record the start, the finish time of each working day and the start and finish time with statutory breaks. And you have to retain those records for 3 years. So, you know, in many businesses where maybe you might clock in and clock out using a physical time card, that's obviously not going to work in some businesses now. And you've got to look at how you can capture that time and maybe look at doing it differently than you've done it before. But your obligation is still there. That has not changed. And there is no understanding of an employer not doing what they're meant to be doing under the law.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Mary, and thanks for your question. I think that came in from Claire. And just having a quick look, I think you should be able to see the results of the poll there, which is quite encouraging, actually. 35% are saying yes, they have spoken. 43% saying they have spoken with some of the employees, with only 22% still sitting on the fence and not having addressed the issue. So that is showing that at least people are engaging with it. And indeed, our attendance here today also demonstrates there's a lot of interest in this general topic area. If I put another question to in from Tom Nelligan, thanks Tom for the question. Mary, if a manager includes in their email signature, you are not expected to reply to this email out of hours, how much protection would that provide? This, of course, would be supported by other practices, etc. What do you think on that, Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very sensible, Tom, to have something like that, you know, built into your email signature or something like that. but it won't provide you with full protection if, for instance, that's in your email signature, or you even put it in the subject line, but yet people still continue to respond to emails after hours. We do operate very much in a bit of a nanny state, which is employee rights based. And I would not recommend that you have that alone. You would need to look at your policies and procedures. You would need a right to disconnect policy. But again, I'm not recommending that you put that in place right now, because we still need to see how it looks when it comes out in its final form. But I think you would need to monitor very carefully what employees are doing. And it won't really be down to choice. The organization or the business is going to have to make decisions around this, and ensure that people are not working beyond their contracted hours.
Very good.
So it's going to represent a whole new way of working. And, you know, for lots of businesses, there are peak periods in which they do require their employees to work beyond their contracted hours at a given time. It'll be interesting to see if there's any exceptions for those kind of businesses, maybe like accountants during busy season, or other organizations at peak points. But right now, there's no real indicator that it's going to be any different for any sector of society.
Thanks, Mary. And we have a situation, at the moment, where we're all working from home, or we're all in lockdown and so on. But what about an employer whose employee has been juggling work with her childcare and is not always available when needed? How is the employer to handle a situation like that?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, John, because, you know, in many ways that employee has no option, because if a school is closed, if they're not an essential worker and they can't get their child into a creche, and neither can they send them to a private provider or have somebody come into their home, it presents a massive challenge. So I would say in the first instance, you need to talk to that employee and agree a change in how they're working for you. So in some cases, that might mean that someone is working from 8 till 10, coming back from 2 till 4, and working into the evening. If that works for your business, okay. If it doesn't, you've got to engage in a different discussion with them. An employee doesn't have the right to dictate their own terms and conditions of employment, but you as an employer have a duty of care to them if they find themselves in a really difficult situation where they really have very limited options. And I'm very thankful that my own children are now raised and I don't face this particular issue, because I couldn't manage them when they were little anyway, never mind try to homeschool them and work at the same time. It is a huge pressure for families, not just women, men and women alike are trying to share the responsibility here. So from an employer perspective, you have a right to get the work done. And you have the right to raise issues if you're not getting the work done. But it needs to be done tactfully, sensitively, and very carefully, so that in raising issues, you're not finding yourself falling foul of any legislation and creating a situation where an employee later raises a grievance.
Yeah, super. And we've kind of on the same topic, we have a question in from Marion there, which kind of focuses in on certain types of employment. Will we need to formalize terms in contracts for employees who are expected to respond in an emergency?
Expected to respond in an emergency, as in being on call. Marion, I'm going to try and interpret that as maybe someone being on call in an emergency.
Yeah,
if something.
Sorry, I probably should clarify. So say a building has a problem, like say for example, Cullen's hotel has a leak and someone is kind of, a manager is expected to attend.
Yeah.
Or the shopping centre, in my case, if there was a fire alert or an incident.
Yeah, and it's outside of normal contracted hours. You would need to build it into the contract of employment, or if there needs to be amendment, if it's not already in the contract of employment, you would need to sit down and agree it with the employee, and potentially pay for it. But that forms part of their normal working conditions. It's really probably more of an issue if you're at home at 10 o'clock at night and you get an email from your manager because your manager happens to be working, and you feel a duty to respond to it, or the issue is critical and you're expected to have a response which involves you working half the night. So yeah, I think you need to think it through very carefully from a business perspective. What do you actually need in place?
Thanks very much for that, Mary. And the topic really is one that we could go on talking about forever. We've taken a huge amount of your time. You've given us a super presentation, for which I thank you very much. I am mindful that I did promise to everybody that we'd finish after 40 or 50 minutes. So what we will do is I'll hand back now in a second to our president, Cullen Ahern, to just say a few words to close the session. But I'll leave the line open for a while after for anybody who wants to stay on, perhaps to chat maybe through cases as well. So Colin, I'll hand over to yourself just to close the session there, please.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Mary. That's you know, whenever I attend or register for such information and webinars, I always come out with more questions and answers. But you did answer quite a lot for me there, and it is really a minefield and something that we're all going to have to work on very sensitively over the next number of months and years. But thank you very much. The Chamber, for those of you that aren't aware, not members, is a supportive and representative organisation for all businesses in Kilkenny. We have a huge and very proactive lobbying voice, which we are using to guide and influence government and others in all aspects of running our country. Today's Chamber Chat is just a small but important part of what we do. We are always interested in hearing from members about what else we can do to assist in these very challenging times. Indeed, we are working on our next Chamber Chat at the moment, which we're hoping will be around the very interesting topic of cybersecurity. Before we go, I would like to draw your attention to another important opportunity that's coming up very shortly. Recognizing that electricity will be increasingly more used for more reasons, like transport and heating, Ireland must make the grid ready so that at least 70% of our electricity can come from renewable sources by 2030. This is quite a challenge, and we've invited EirGrid to tell us what they are doing to make the electricity grid stronger and more flexible. And this event will take place tomorrow, Friday at 11 a.m. via Zoom. So if you're interested in attending, it's free to register. Just email admin@kilkennychamber.com and we will send you the Zoom details. And please also keep an eye on our weekly newsletter for information and updates of future news and events on an ongoing basis. So thank you very much for joining us today. Stay safe and continued success to all of you in your businesses.